Right now, we're about 2/3 of households have broadband service in this country without any broadband subsidy at all. And about 95% of homes have access to broadband at their home. So 5% of the country doesn't have access. 95% does, and 2/3 actually take broadband service right now. These are important numbers to think about because this big 300-page broadband report has huge ambitions for what are we going to do to get more people connected. Well, part of it is to try to get the 2/3 up higher, and the other part is to try to get that 95% up higher to 100%. And I'll talk about getting the 95 to 100% in a minute. What we want to think about is if you want to move the 95% up to 100%, it's very, very expensive. So this is a graph that I used in a research paper on telephone service. And what it does is it shows the cost of telephone service, the cost, not the price, based on what percent of lines. So if you see that 80% of lines for telephone service cost about $22 a month. That's the 80th percentile. Okay? So 80% of lines cost less than $22 a month to provide. And these are wired lines going to everybody's house. We're not talking about wireless. If you want to get to 90%, it's about $30 a month. And 95% is $40 a month. So but if you see the long tail, and I don't know where the clicker is, so you can see the long tail anyway, up on this end is very, very, very expensive. And unfortunately, it looks like it shows that it goes to 100% at $90 a month. It doesn't. It goes about $10,000 a month if you want to get wires to Ted Kaczynski's house out in Montana. It's very expensive to provide service to rural areas and where density is very low. And it turns out it's I'm going to turn this off now. It's very expensive to provide service in rural areas even if you use wireless technologies. But satellite technologies can provide service to rural areas. There is a problem if you can get broadband anywhere in this country. What I said before was 95% have access to broadband. I meant to say 95% have access to terrestrial broadband. 100%, maybe not in northern Alaska, have access to satellite service, broadband satellite service. There is a difference in broadband service over satellites, which is that it takes half a second for the signal to travel. So if you are very, very into online gaming, you will die very quickly if you use satellite service. So it may be a matter of life and death to have terrestrial service, but not real life and death. So one of the things that you heard a lot about in the last panel was experiments. And but one of the things that the FCC is thinking about doing is actually doing some experiments about universal service. And disclosure is that I've been talking to the FCC about encouraging this and talking to some of the companies they may work with to try to do an experiment to figure out, there are low-income subsidy programs for telephone service that I've studied. And there's legislation, Doris Matsui from Sacramento has talked about adding Lifeline and LinkUp low-income subsidy programs for broadband. Now, one of the things you'd want to think about, as David and Hal talked about, is how do you evaluate this? How do you understand how effective this would be? Well, you try to design an experiment that says, if we do a randomized set of trials where we have some low-income households that get $5 a month off, some that get $20 a month off, how can we figure out how important this monthly subsidy is? And so we're trying to figure out ways to implement an experiment over the course of, say, 2 years, because you'd want to figure out, if you could do this, you'd want to do a whole bunch of different experiments, different levels of pricing, maybe some that test my heroin dealer problem, which is what happens if you take off the subsidy after a year? Do people stay online after a year, or do they give it up when the subsidy is gone? So these kinds of things that you'd want to try and do. So I think that's great. The other piece that I wish they would, that they did not make any mention of and have not thought about, is for these for these incredibly high-cost areas in rural areas, we spend a huge amount of money on rural high-cost telephone service, as Chairman Janikowski mentioned. He said, well, we're going to get rid of the subsidies for the old technology, and we're going to put it in broadband. What this does is this is going to, in my mind, this is taking this money and putting it in a different bucket, but not doing anything to try to reduce it. If we had experiments and determined for low-income people, I think we should also try and figure out what's the effect of broadband subsidies for rural areas. There are a lot of rich people who live in rural areas, and we're subsidizing those people. And the question is, would we want to do experiments? I don't think the FCC, first of all, I don't think it needs to do experiments for two reasons. One is because we already have strong evidence that economists have looked at for telephone service showing that there is no effect of rural broadband subsidies on subscribership. We're giving a lot of money to rich people anyway in rural areas, and we can just do it on a low-income basis, on a more pervasive basis. And the second is that the problem is that there's incredible political support, again, for rural telephone companies that get these subsidies. So the FCC doesn't want to do an experiment on that. One thing that's been in the news a lot, and also part of my research, but was omitted from the broadband plan, and I think appropriately so, was net neutrality. I think you're going to hear more about that this afternoon, but to me, right now, I've talked about it, I don't think it's going to make a big impact of the overall future of the internet as long as we have policies that make broadband competition available on a facilities basis. Then I think the facilities-based providers right now haven't been doing things that are problematic for net neutrality, and I think that that will continue if you have the competition. So the last thing I wanted to talk about was sort of that Chairman Janikowski talked about our position relative to the world in broadband. We have, as I said, 2/3 of the people, and it's an incredible, it's a pretty steep increase in the broadband penetration, has been going up and is expected to continue to go up. So we are maybe a year or two behind other countries. We're not hugely behind other countries in terms of penetration. The best thing for increasing penetration, in my mind, would not be spending the billions and billions of dollars to get from 95% homes passed by terrestrial broadband to 100%, but trying to make sure that we do this spectrum policy that the task force says, so we can reduce the price of broadband to people in the 95% and get them to subscribe more. So as the video said, everything is amazing. I think it's going to be amazing and continue to change. And you're going to see a lot of new ideas of amazing things at lunch. So I think I'm going to stop talking now and let Derek tell you about the amazing things at Google.